It was a Friday evening, and I had just returned home, exhausted from work. All I wanted was a relaxing shower and some time in front of the TV. Everything seemed normal when I arrived home. I opened the door, took off my shoes, and let the silence of the house take over. After a refreshing shower, I lay down on the couch. At midnight, I heard a faint noise. It came from the kitchen. Since I was sure I was alone at home, the sound made me uneasy. I quietly approached the kitchen. I could sense someone was behind the kitchen door. I slightly pushed it open and saw that no one was inside. Just as I felt relieved, I heard a breathing sound behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. My heart started to race. At that moment, I realized something was wrong. I turned off the kitchen light and started heading back to my room when I caught a glimpse of the mirror by the door. In the mirror, I saw someone else standing behind me, looking over my shoulder. But when I turned around, there was no one. That night, sleeping was impossible. While lying in bed, I constantly felt like someone was watching me. The more I tried to close my eyes, the faster my heart pounded. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the unease lingered for days. Since that night, I've never found the same peace in my home again. I always feel someone's presence, but I can't see them. One weekend, I went camping with my friends in a remote village far from the city. We found a campsite deep in the forest and set up our tents. The first day was perfect. We built a fire, sang songs, and gazed at the stars. But on the second day, things started to get strange. Late in the afternoon, a small child appeared at our campsite. He was about 7 or 8 years old, dressed in shabby clothes, with a dirty face and a sad expression. We asked the child what he was doing there, and he simply said, "I'm lost. I want to go home." We tried to calm him down and figure out where he lived, but his answers were inconsistent. That night, the child fell asleep by the fire. When we woke up the next morning, he was gone. We searched the area, but found no trace of him. Just then, a local villager approached us and said, "You didn't find that boy, did you?" Surprised, we asked, "How do you know?" The man took a deep breath and replied, "That boy got lost here years ago. Whenever someone camps here, he returns, only to disappear again." At that moment, we realized that the child we saw was actually the spirit of a boy who had been missing for years. We quickly packed up our camp and left. However, the boy's face still haunts me, and whenever I go to a forest, I feel like someone is watching me from the shadows. A few years ago, when my grandmother passed away, I went to her house to gather her belongings. It was an old house, dark, cold, and filled with memories in every corner. In her room, I found an old chest. It looked ancient and heavy, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Succumbing to my curiosity, I opened the chest. Inside were a few old clothes, some letters, and a strange doll. The doll was very old. Its eyes were black, its face was pale, and it had an eerie expression. I closed the chest and was about to leave the room when suddenly the door slammed shut on its own. I didn't know what to do. I ran to the door and tried to open it, but it felt locked. At that moment, I heard a whisper behind me. "Let me out," the voice echoed. Terrified, I turned to look at the chest, and the doll had turned towards me. I quickly reopened the chest, placed the doll back inside, and rushed out of the room. When I left my grandmother's house, my heart was still racing. That day, I realized I never wanted to see that doll again. However, a few days later, when I returned to sell my grandmother's house, I found that the chest was open again, and the doll was gone. Since then,
I've constantly felt like that doll is following me. I have no idea where it is, but its gaze still haunts me.
There was an old, unused hospital building in our town that had become the center of terrifying stories. One day, my friends and I decided to explore this hospital. As soon as we stepped inside the crumbling structure, I felt a heavy presence in the air. The cold, damp corridors stretched ahead of us, and with each step, I felt as if something was watching us. When we reached the top floor, we found an old operating room. The moment we stepped inside, I heard the door behind us slowly creak shut. We all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Then, from the far corner of the room, a faint rustling sound caught my attention. I turned my gaze and saw a figure in a white coat, its face obscured, standing in the corner. I was paralyzed with fear as the figure began to move towards us, its steps eerily silent. I backed away in terror, realizing that my friends were seeing the same figure. We tried to escape, but the door seemed locked. Panicked, we struggled to get out while the figure disappeared, leaving behind an icy chill. Finally, we managed to open the door and fled the hospital. None of us ever dared to return to that place, but even now, when I close my eyes at night, I still feel that figure watching me. One day, while visiting a small town outside the city, I decided to explore an old cemetery. The cemetery was almost entirely forgotten, overgrown with weeds. As I quietly wandered among the graves, an old weathered tombstone caught my attention. The name on it felt oddly familiar, but I couldn't place where I knew it from. The tombstone bore a birth and death date, and strangely, the death date was today's date. A chill ran down my spine. When I read the name again, it suddenly seemed even more familiar. I looked around, but I was alone in the cemetery. Then I heard a whisper in the wind, almost as if someone was calling out to me, "Come." I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to move and hurried out of the cemetery. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the name on the tombstone. I turned on my computer and searched for the name, and what I found filled me with dread. The person had the same birth date as mine and had died on this very day. Since that day, I've been haunted by thoughts of my own death, feeling as if it's creeping closer. I've never visited that tombstone again, but I can't shake the growing feeling that my end is near. A few months ago, I went on a solo hiking trip in a remote forest that I had always wanted to explore. The forest was known for its dense trees and serene atmosphere, perfect for someone looking to escape the chaos of city life. I set up camp near a small clearing, enjoying the peaceful surroundings as the sun began to set. As night fell, I started hearing faint whispers carried by the wind. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than the sounds of nature, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. It felt like someone was calling my name, but there was no one around. I decided to investigate, thinking maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I followed the whispers deeper into the woods, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I stood still, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something moving between the trees. It was a shadowy figure, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It seemed to be watching me, and every time I moved, it mirrored my actions. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't alone in these woods. I quickly turned back, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different, almost as if it had shifted. The trees felt closer, the path narrower, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. Panic set in as I tried to find my way back to camp, but the figure continued to follow me, its presence growing stronger. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled into my campsite, but the whispers didn't stop. I packed up my things and left the forest immediately. To this day, I can still hear those whispers when I'm alone, as if the forest never really let me go. A few years ago, I worked as a taxi driver in a small town. One night, I was driving along a quiet, deserted road when I saw a woman standing on the side of the road, waving for a ride. She looked normal enough, though a bit pale and wearing old-fashioned clothing. I pulled over, and she got into the back seat. She told me an address that I vaguely recognized as being on the outskirts of town, and we set off. As I drove, I tried to make small talk, but she remained silent, staring out the window. There was something unsettling about her, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The ride was quiet, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind. When we finally reached the destination, it was an old, abandoned house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I turned around to tell her we'd arrived, but the back seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat. I got out of the car, frantically looking around, thinking she might have slipped out without me noticing, but there was no sign of her. The house stood silently in the moonlight, and a chill ran down my spine. I quickly got back in the car and drove off, not daring to look back. The next day, I told a colleague about the experience, and his face turned pale. He said I wasn't the first driver to pick up a passenger who disappeared upon arriving at that house. Apparently, many years ago, a woman had died in a car accident on that very road, and her spirit had been seen trying to get home ever since. I never drove that route at night again, but sometimes, late at night, I can still feel her presence in the back seat, as if she's still waiting to reach her destination.